I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. Joining us here on the 6th of July is Mr. Jaren Boslow. Jaren, the Mavericks have actually done something in free agency for once. They facilitated a sign and trade with the Boston Celtics and San Antonio Spurs to where they were able to get Grant Williams on a 4-year, $53 million deal in a sign and trade. The sort of stipulations of the deal were that Reggie Bullock went to the San Antonio Spurs. The Mavericks ended up giving the Spurs a 2030 pick swap, essentially, for their first-round pick. So whoever has the better pick, they are able to flip positions there. Otherwise, the Mavericks got 2 seconds in the deal, and Boston got 2 seconds as well, and they were able to shed some salary. The Mavericks also offered Matisse Thybulle a 3-year, $33 million offer sheet, to which Portland was able to match this morning. But obviously a huge day in Dallas Mavericks free agent history, I guess I should say, given the the recent corruption really since the championship has ensued. Jaren, what was your reaction to these moves made yesterday? Are you excited? And what is the sentiment around the Mavericks fan base right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think fans pretty much everywhere who, no matter what type of fanship you are in terms of Dallas Maverick, you should definitely be excited. You should definitely be happy for what is to come. I mean, Grant Williams, a guy who pretty much has been targeted since day one, free agency, or at least has been rumored since trades were kind of being, I guess, we're kind of happening, or we're allowed to happen. He's been one of the guys that have been at the top of the list, and a lot of fans and a lot of the front office sort of views. So definitely very excited. And the Mavericks are actually making productive moves, which is very surprising, very rare to hear. But this year almost seems like it might be the turn of the century. It might be a turnaround for this team. I mean, this has been an amazing offseason, and this Grant Williams trade only adds to it. I mean, for a while there, I know that everyone is starting to get a little antsy. Just kind of, I think it was 5 days, pretty much between nothing happening. And I could tell that, everyone is getting a little antsy. Everyone was kind of expecting things to happen by then. And of course they hadn't, but Grant Williams finally coming to Dallas, and a huge deal where if we're being honest, I think, Dallas, of course, probably got the better end out of anyone here. But I think all teams were pretty fairly, I guess, prized, or they got pretty fair compensation for what they traded. So yeah. So I don't think that all three teams should have got fleeced or anything like that. So overall, I think it was a great trade for all three teams. And of course, I mean, no bias, or try not to be as much as bias. I think Dallas probably walked away with the best end, considering that they got 2 second-round picks in the process. But yeah, I mean, on the court, this is going to be very fun. He's a great locker room guy. We saw his time in Boston. I mean, he was filled up with memes. Of course, him in a Batman suit speaking to the media is definitely probably top of the top in terms of memes in his career so far. But I mean, he's a great locker room guy, a guy who's going to bring a lot of energy. And not just that, but he's going to do the little things right on the court. And, I'm very excited for this. I think Mavericks fans alike should be very excited. And for, if any reason, if you are a Grant Williams fan, I'm sure we'll see them now. But I don't know if those do exist, but y'all should be very excited as well, because playing alongside Kyrie and Luka is going to be very fun and very exciting for his young career. I mean, he's only been in the league for 4 years, going into his 5th. So I'm very excited to see what the on-court product is going to be. But I love this move. A+. If there's anything higher than an A+, I would tally it as that.
No, definitely. The Mavericks finally get their bigger wing, a guy who historically has been one of the better three-point shooters in the league, surprisingly, at least from a catch-and-shoot perspective. A guy that can fit seamlessly from, with Luka and Kyrie, obviously on defense, with his ability to rotate over as the low man and be a weak side rim protector at times, but also as his on ball ability is second to none. This is a guy that can guard really 2 through 4 sometimes, sometimes even 5s, just sort of depending on the matchup. He's going to be a huge cog in Jason Kidd's scheme, and offensively he'll be the benefactor of a lot of other drawn attention to Luka and Kyrie, and a guy who's not one dimensional. He can operate off the dribble, attack off a closeout, do some different things. This is a premier signing for the Mavericks at really good value. Grant Williams was rumored to, of course, maybe get over 15 million. So this is about as good as it gets from that perspective. We'll get more into the Matisse Thybulle offer sheet along with what the Mavericks could potentially do next. But they finally make a move when the Grant Williams rumors, I wouldn't say they had all but fizzled out, but the PJ Washington rumors to Dallas were definitely at the forefront, and there wasn't too much smoke, sort of dissipating out of the Mavericks canister there that said Grant Williams on it. And now all of a sudden he is here after, Tim McMahon even said that he thought he didn't know how likely it was for Grant Williams to come to Dallas, given some members in the front office were sort of iffy about him or whatever just a few days ago. And, the rumors have been at the forefront really since well before free agency, but something finally happens here. It's a matter of execution. The Mavericks finally execute upon a rumor that was in the mill in a free agency period. At least I'll give them the benefit of the doubt after this past trade deadline, but in a free agency period. And Nico is continuing to master all facets of transaction within the NBA, and it's a really beautiful thing to see. The Mavericks, I think, still hopefully have more to do, so we'll get into that a lot in this podcast, as well as some of Grant Williams' fit and a bunch of other stuff. Maybe not a full-fledged player profile today, but we'll definitely get into how the fit is and the player that we're looking at here. But it's an exciting time on the Mainstream Mavs podcast for us. Just a little over a year ago, we were in despair, having just started the podcast.
Absolutely.
Just two wandering individuals caught up in a perpetual cycle of Mavs free agency failures, poised to do our best to justify whatever was happening, even though we knew that it was unjustifiable. Jaren, we have justifiable sort of signings, transactions here from the Mavericks, and that's, I think, the big key in this. The Mavericks actually did something that we can look at and then not have a complete negative spin on it, and that's really all we need to go ahead and head into the ad read here on such a positive note. So here is an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters, and we will catch you guys after the break. All right, Jaren. So I guess we'll go ahead and cover the Grant Williams news first, even though sequentially the Matisse Thybulle news obviously came first. And then I'm honestly kind of happy that we had to delay this podcast a little bit, because had we done it last night, we would still be under the anticipation that the Blazers have yet to match. But of course they did match that offer sheet. But with Grant Williams, Jaren, could you just speak to the overall significance of getting a guy in Dallas who actually wants to be here? This is a guy during the regular season who Luka Doncic, I believe, sent a signed jersey to. It's a guy who, already changed, his Instagram and Twitter profiles, all his social medias, to Dallas Mavs. He seems, uber excited to get here and fit in with the current, rendition of the team that could obviously still, be still, a little restructured, but we'll see how that happens, or if it does at all. But nonetheless, I mean, this is a fairly significant, given just the last few years of free agents historically not really wanting to be in Dallas outside of, really since 2011. Guys that are, even somewhat significant, maybe Monte Ellis, Chandler Parsons, Harrison Barnes. And even then, those weren't necessarily moves that were, in an attempt to thrust the Mavericks into contention at the time. What does it mean to have a guy like Grant Williams, as good of a locker room guy is, as good of a teammate he is, only 24. As excited as he is to be in Dallas and play with Luka and Kyrie, what does that mean for this Mavericks team?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Grant Williams, of course, speaking to sort of his locker room ability and locker room effect, he's a great teammate. I mean, a lot of what Boston did in the playoffs was in large part to Grant Williams' role. I mean, I believe in the first round, he was kind of more, used every few games. Didn't have a huge role that first, and I believe that early second round, but very quickly, the leaders on that team, like Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, they were very quickly calling for his name, calling for him to get bigger minutes and have a bigger role in the playoffs. And they made it all the way to a game 7 in that Eastern Conference Finals, in large part due to what he did off the bench. So I think you're going to get a great teammate, a guy who's, willing to do pretty much anything for the team to win. I think, in one of the articles that I read, I forget who wrote it. Yeah, I honestly don't remember who wrote it, but in one of the articles that I read about him, he was more than willing to take a seat back in Boston and, kind of play a reserve sort of role on that team as long as they were winning. So, he's a winning first type of guy. He's willing to do the small things to get the wins. He's probably going to be the type guy to dive on the floor, show some toughness, show some grittiness. And that's what this Mavericks team is in dire need of. And not just that, but also positionally, he's more of a 3-and-D wing. I mean, he was kind of the second best defender on guys like Embiid and guys like Jokic in the regular season for Boston. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him not necessarily be a primary matchup on those two or on those sort of bigger centers, but he can definitely be a switch defender in that scenario. So I would be very surprised if the Mavericks do not use him in that sort of role. I think that they definitely will use that. But look, I mean, like I said, you're getting a guy who's, willing to do the small things to get the win, get some grittiness, get some toughness out in there. And that's what this Mavericks team needed. So I'm very stoked. I'm very excited to see what he can do. I mean, he only shot 39.5% from 3, which is great numbers. That's like a career low almost, I think. But still, great numbers from 3. And not just that, but he almost averaged 6 rebounds or 5 rebounds. I can't remember for the last season. So I mean, he's a guy, like I said, that's going to do the small things, going to do the effort things to try and get a win. And I'm very excited. I mean, at this point, Will, I don't really know what arguments you have against this, but I mean, heck, is he the Mavericks' third best player at this point? Because I know likely he'll be starting. And outside of that, I can't really think of anyone who might have a bigger role than him, of course, other than Kyrie and Luka.
I mean, honestly, I was honestly probably going to carry the same sentiment that, that question sort of took me aback when I had to really think about it. Seeing as the Mavericks, still could get a guy that may be a little bit better. It also kind of tampers the excitement down a little when, you realize the sort of talent deficiency on this team. But besides that, I mean, they have a sort of cast here of really good role players. And, while the Mavericks still, do have some areas of improvement that we'll talk about later in the pod, that definitely, I think we both probably carry the same sentiment that they're going to need to improve upon that if they still wish to be, these tried and true title contenders, like we've sort of hypothesized, given, they made the Kyrie Irving move back in February, and that's the direction that we've been saying that they've been poised to go and need to go in. But I mean, as of right now, Grant Williams might be the third player on this team, to answer your question. And that's not even really a knock upon him. It more so shows the versatility that this guy adds from, both a defensive perspective and, how seamlessly he can fit in, as a good role player on the other end. This is a guy who's extremely physical. He has about a 6'10" wingspan at 6'6", 6'7", whatever he's listed at. So it's not, he doesn't have the most insane length in the world, but he's also not a complete square with those dimensions. And on top of that, I mean, he's a very stout 240, and he uses his measurables, I mean, to the best of his advantages, like you had just, sort of talked about, Jaren. This is a guy that if he is, to get scram switched mid-possession for whatever reason, the Mavericks are lacking some size on the floor, he's a guy that can anchor down and guard some of these bigger bodied centers, just strictly due to his base, strictly due to his strength and physicality as a defender. He'll be able to anchor down. And, oftentimes at least be able to derail, certain centers, be able to get a hand in their face. This isn't a guy that is the most insanely athletic, guy on the planet, but he's not a slouch by any means. And to get him at 24, a very versatile defender, really 2 through 5 on occasions. Even though I think he definitely is more poised to guard 2 through 4 most of the time. And a guy that can, knock down any catch and shoot three at a moment's notice, especially with some of the sort of looks he's going to get in Dallas here. I mean, he'll almost be spoon fed some of these looks here in the corner and stuff like that. Playing probably the 4 for the Mavericks. I mean, he hops in honestly probably as an instant starter, and this guy is going to be a very high end role player for the Mavericks on a 4-year deal. Is something that I didn't even think in my wildest dreams I'd really be able to come out of this sort of saying here. Not that I didn't think his deal would be 4 years, but to nail a guy like Grant Williams down really throughout the early prime and middle prime of his career, probably during his potentially best contract throughout his career as a role player. I mean, is nothing short of a great move by Nico Harrison, Dennis Lindsey, whatever other players are in the front office, Andrew Baker. The Mavericks really hit the nail on the head with this specific move. They needed a bigger bodied wing who could guard the LeBrons, KDs of the world in this very tough, rigid Western Conference, and they were able to get it here with Grant Williams, the complete antithesis of a sort of one-dimensional 3-and-D wing. He's a guy that can also take a defender off the dribble on occasion, use some of that size in terms of his post ability, in the mid post, coming downhill to really throw defenders off kilter and get to the rim. He has a really good basketball IQ, a really good feel for the game. This is a guy that, you wouldn't, that you honestly would like on any team, even if he wasn't starting for another team and they had a better 3 or a 4. He's still a guy that fits really seamlessly in any lineup. And for him to be in Dallas is, like I said, is nothing short of amazing. It's something that we've been honestly lusting after in terms of getting a sort of coveted free agent acquisition since the genesis of the Nico Harrison era. And it's finally coming into fruition here. And, we're going to see if the Mavericks have more moves here in the toolbox, more things they can pull off. But what a fit to add to Kyrie and Luka, and the Mavericks finally acquire a starting level role player, throughout this offseason. They have acquired some solid pieces throughout this offseason, particularly in the draft, in Seth Curry, Olivier Maxence Prosper, Derek Lively II. But, to get a, day one definitive starter, a guy who wants to be here, is honestly a dream come true. And I hope the Mavericks continue churning upon this brigade, use this momentum to do some other things, and really stay steadfast in their approach to this free agency period. But like I said, they really hit the nail on the head with this Grant Williams move.
Yeah, absolutely. And to touch up on, sort of the more intangibles, I mean, the Mavericks receiving 2 second-round picks in the deal as well is going to be very huge, and just, what they can possibly do with those, and just from a sort of roster building standpoint. So I know that we'll touch up on that a little bit later, but I mean, look, they added another young guy to this sort of young pool of players that are now going to be sort of your front runners on a team that's, still, of course, shifting and still, of course, developing. But I mean, this team all of a sudden got very young. They added yet another, 24-year-old or 25 and younger guy to this roster. So I'm excited, from that standpoint. Not necessarily saying your future is like locked up or anything like that. But this team has all of a sudden built up its assets, built up its sort of future movability and future sort of flexibility, that is. And, this team, I mean, this summer, I wouldn't be opposed to 2 more moves. I think that they possibly have 2 more moves in them. I know that we'll probably touch up on that a little later, but They just, I guess they just kind of secured or locked up, these high level, high caliber younger guys. And I mean, I'm very excited to see what they can do on the court. Because I think Grant Williams, especially him, he's probably gonna have the biggest role out of any of our young players. But I mean, heck, he's gonna come in there, and like I said, he's probably gonna start at the 3, maybe even 4, just kind of depending how this roster rounds out. So we'll definitely see. But yeah, I really like the fit. I really like the move. And just from a trading perspective, it's a very, very good trade. And I mean, look, this is the first trade that the Mavericks have made in a long time where the national media has definitely been liking this one a lot. So I think from that standpoint, it's cool as well. So I love this move from the Mavericks. Of course, I've said it a million times now, and I know you've said it, Will. But like I said, I can't get enough of it, and I'm in love with it. So I'm very excited to see the future.
No, most definitely. I mean, the Mavericks have established a sort of young core here after this Grant Williams move, which is kind of weird to say. He's a guy that I honestly thought was a little bit older, but I mean, he's only 24, and he adds on to a sort of array of role players here, potentially paired with Luka Doncic, that even in the post Kyrie Irving era, can sort of carry the boats here for the Mavericks, and potentially. You're looking at a package now with some of the pieces that the Mavericks have on this roster to where they could swing a trade for a third star in a few years. And I'm not trying to get too far ahead of myself or anything like that in terms of forecasting what they're going to do years on from now when, the focus and the direction of this franchise is one in which they want to contend, probably this year. But the Mavericks do have a pool of really good young players given their, 2 recent drafts, getting Jaden Hardy, Olivier Maxence Prosper, as well as Derek Lively, and Josh Green, paired in tandem with Luka and Grant Williams. I'm not saying that I want any of those guys to leave unless, a sort of undeniable trade came into fruition that didn't involve Luka, of course. I mean, I think that we can both agree he's obviously untouchable. But it does give you a lot of flexibility going forward to add a guy like this on a very tradable contract like that, in tandem with those guys, years out. So, like I said, I'm not trying to forecast what's going to happen. I'm not trying to say I want Grant Williams to leave. I think he can be a Maverick for a very long time. All I'm saying, essentially, is that the Mavericks do have a lot more, sort of increased flexibility with the trades they can make in the long term, as well as the short term, right? But just in the long term, they have guys that other teams may potentially actually want now. When you're looking at getting some of these more coveted guys around the league at the trade deadline that we just really haven't been able to do, get or facilitate a trade of that matter, they can do that now. So it opens up that as well in the future. Even though, like I said, I don't think they're going to be trading any of those guys. And the young cast in Dallas is something that I think is really special because the Mavericks are setting a foundation even when the Luka Kyrie sort of era comes to an end, when Kyrie fizzles out, when he gets too old, whenever that happens. And, that could be 2 years from now, that could be 4 or 5 years from now, but to set the groundwork in a sort of Warriors-esque way, the way that they kind of did with some of their draft picks, with the Mavericks not necessarily having top end draft capital year after year, really barring that 10th pick, it is really indicative of how savvy Nico Harrison and that front office has been since this offseason started. I mean, up until this point, even though I sort of went on a Twitter rant yesterday after Jake Fisher published an article that said the Mavericks were not going after PJ Washington, and he didn't say this word for word, but essentially because PJ Washington was a big and not a wing, which was one of the more comical sort of sentences in a paragraph I'd read recently. But after that, I was definitely a little bit distraught. I was starting to, kind of let my delusion be led astray, given that I thought the, off season actually may be sort of culminating into an end there. Given recent Mavs off seasons where they, say they're going to address an issue and then, only sort of pseudo address an issue and then try to justify it by them not having the financial flexibility to pull something off, which I mean, in a lot of the instances in terms of the guys they missed out on so far in this free agency, the primary reason for that is, mostly the Mavericks didn't have the money to get a lot of these guys, or they, some of these guys wanted to go to more coveted cities like an LA or a New York or something bougie like that. But, in the position that the Mavericks are currently in, I think that they, did a great job for what they, had working, and they still have the potential to use some of this, flexibility that they were able to, both gain from the draft and some that was just kind of previously slated beforehand. Given Kyrie's contract and some of the other stuff with the, $9 million that they are currently under the first tax apron. Just the sort of order of operations here gives them the ability to still use the full mid-level exception after the Matisse Thybulle move. So, I mean, just, from a flexibility perspective, as well as bolstering, an already promising young core, I thought that this was a great move. And I think we'll get into Grant Williams a lot more on future podcasts, Jaren, and we'll dive into, his fit as well as, more of a deep dive of him as a player and the basketball intangibles, things of that nature. But, at face value, covering the fit and for, I assume his contract will be ascending to a slight degree, but at only 4 years, 13.5 million, just slightly above that mid-level exception, the Mavericks were able to, really hit the nail on the head with a very, lucrative, fair, team-friendly sort of deal here. And it's very promising from that perspective. Jaren, a lot of fans obviously loved the Bang Bros. They loved Dorian Finney-Smith and Reggie Bullock's pairing and their ability to, be those primary 3-and-D guys for the Mavericks. They obviously sort of spearheaded the defense within that 2021-2022 playoff campaign where the Mavericks went to the Western Conference Finals. It was met not with a disastrous end, but a little bit of a sort of unwinding, sort of negative, just sort of bland end to Reggie Bullock's time in Dallas here.
Yeah, a little negative departure, but
yeah. And
I think it was a little bit of a negative departure. So,
but I mean, what did you? I mean, I wouldn't say it was like a negative departure in terms of there being any bad blood there, but it was definitely negative from the perspective of how he kind of ended his time in Dallas. Just kind of on a somber note. Wasn't playing the best basketball of his career, to say the least. Obviously, we send our well wishes to Reggie in San Antonio or anywhere else if he ends up getting, bought out or stretch waived or something of that nature. But this is a guy that came in and played hard for 82 games every year for the Mavericks. I don't know if he actually played 82 games, but he played like he was playing 82 games, just in terms of the attention to detail and the effort that he applied every night. He really was a true pro, a guy that was always ready for battle. He obviously definitely fell short of his sort of, I don't know, his trajectory in terms of what he may have has been on in his career. This was maybe the first season that we saw Reggie Bullock's game wane a little bit. He maybe wasn't as much of the Reggie Bullock as old, not just from a 3-point perspective. He always has those beginning of season sort of slumps, but, this one seemed like there was, almost an added layer of sort of deficiency there. And on top of that, he did just look a little bit slower on defense. He also looked a little bit less physical on defense, was getting beat a little bit more this year. But overall, I wouldn't say it was like the complete worst season in the world for him. He definitely still contributed and, was tasked with a larger role than he was probably ready for, being the, primary wing defender, really the only wing defender on this roster after the Kyrie trade. If you would have asked me, before the offseason started, if he was going to be the first one to get traded for the Mavericks. I honestly probably would have said maybe Tim Hardaway Jr. was out the door first. But Reggie is actually the first guy out the door. Jaren, do you have any other sentiments that you would like to carry over for Reggie after his little 2-year stint in Dallas? Do you want to send him on any well wishes or anything else that you'd like to say before we give our sort of lasting thoughts before the Mavericks play their 45-second farewell tribute video when they first play the Spurs this coming season, the AAC?
Yeah, absolutely. I shout out to Reggie. I mean, he was an integral part of our playoff run in 2022. But look, I mean, you can't hate the move. Like I said, I mean, he's a guy. I think he played 78 games, including. I'm not sure if he sat out against San Antonio in the last game of the season, so he may have played 80. But I do know that he sat out for 2 due to injury reasons, and then outside of that, like I said, I'm not really sure of. So, but look, I mean, yeah, he's a Class A pro. San Antonio is getting a good veteran, a guy who, of course, can shoot and play some defense. But look, I mean, first things first, you're replacing Grant Williams with Reggie Bullock, which is an automatic upgrade in my book. So, outside of that, I hope Victor Wembanyama enjoys Bullock Island. And I hope that Spurs team, Spurs organization takes advantage of that because, look, I mean, I don't know what all there is to do in San Antonio besides going to Bullock Island and going to the Bahamas and enjoying some nice sun because they won't be making the playoffs next year. I'm just playing; they actually might. But in all seriousness, though, shout out to Reggie, and I do hope that his career or his time in San Antonio goes well. And look, I mean, if he is going to get bought out, I still think he has a role in the NBA. So shout out to him, and I hope he does well wherever he is, if it's not San Antonio.
Yeah, no, I mean, even though Reggie is waning a little bit in terms of his productivity as a, integral sort of 3-and-D starter, that stage in his career may start to be passing, given he's 32 now. I still think that he can contribute to an NBA roster in the right role for sure. Can definitely carve out a nice little niche for himself in the league over the maybe next 3 or 4 years if he's able to stay healthy, still be a solid 3-and-D wing off the bench. So all the best wishes to him. I'm sorry his time in Dallas couldn't end on a better note, but this was a no-brainer sort of move to move a guy like Reggie at his age, at that $10 million figure, a guy who definitely, was sort of waning in production last year, but, also even if you do keep him around and add some other pieces, he still just isn't on the trajectory and timeline of Luka Doncic, and you get a guy in Grant Williams that can guard a little bit higher, maybe isn't as of good, as a point of attack defender as Reggie, but in all other areas, he honestly might be better. Even in the 3-point shooting category, he's definitely at least in the neighborhood of Reggie Bullock at this stage in his career. And, it's definitely a definitive upgrade, especially with the Mavericks getting those 2 second-round picks to be able to wheel and deal in other trades. So Jaren, I mean, let's just go ahead and, point blank rather, get into it here with the Mavericks of flexibility. Marc Stein said on his sort of Substack chat where he's been interacting with fans and things of that nature, that the Mavericks are by no means done in terms of them being poised to acquire a starting center here. They still realize that's an area where they're lacking. Now maybe a move doesn't come into fruition for him. Maybe they're not able to do that. Maybe the Mavericks really aren't even to somehow use their MLE, or they just neglect to, and they'd rather, operate $9 million under the apron for absolutely no reason at all. You never know. They just don't view any guy that's, coveted enough to be signed with that money. And maybe they just want to restructure the way that some of their deals were made, and they just, say, screw it. Now that would be, definitely asset and roster malpractice if they were to sort of choose that route. But if the offseason were to end today for the Mavericks, Jaren, what do you give this offseason after the Grant Williams move?
Yeah, I mean, after the Grant Williams move, it definitely improves the needle. I mean, for the first time, you can confidently say, outside of, re-signing Kyrie, of course, but for the first time, you can confidently say, in terms of this season, they got a guy who's going to move the needle with Grant Williams. So I still would probably roam in the range of a B+ or an A- because again, I think that this team is still 1-2 moves away from being complete. There's still a backup wing, or maybe even another starting caliber at this point. You never know. And a starting center away from being, where this team needs to be. So I'm not going to say, full on, it's going to be an A+ offseason after that Grant trade. But look, the Mavericks have come out, or at least per Marc Stein, have come out and said that they are still active in the trade market for a starting center. And, to your point, those 2 second-round picks definitely make more flexibility options possible. And of course, you retain Tim Hardaway, and you retain and you keep JaVale McGee in the process. So
And
I mean,
Rashawn
there's more
Holmes.
trading. Yeah, Rashawn Holmes. I'm
But
still a little confused about that situation.
so just for a quick footnote, real quick, Rashawn Holmes cannot be traded in aggregate anymore. As soon as they make that trade where they
Okay.
got him and Olivier Maxence Prosper back, I believe it's like 2 months that he can't be traded in aggregate with another player because he was newly acquired by the Mavericks. Now I know they haven't really made that trade official yet, so I think a lot of people are still exactly wondering what's going to happen. Mavs PR, was supposed to, no, or not supposed to, but the first official day the Mavericks could make that Rashawn Holmes thing completely official was today, and it doesn't seem like they've done it yet. So I mean, he still could be on the chop block. I'll go check Mavs PR. I checked it before we started the podcast, but I have not looked at it since to see if there's been anything new on that front. But if Rashawn Holmes is indeed officially acquired by the Mavericks, they can only trade him by himself. He cannot be traded in aggregate with any other player. I mean, they can ship him out with draft picks and stuff like that, but they can't combine his salary with anybody else in a trade. So that is a quick sort of footnote real quick, for everybody wondering how that situation is going to play out. But Tim Hardaway Jr., JaVale McGee, I mean, even Maxi Kleber, given the right circumstance, as well as that 2027 first round pick. And now I don't know exactly what the years were on that those seconds rather.
I feel like it was like 25 and 26.
Yeah, well, I thought it was like
I'm
25, and I thought maybe one was a 2030. I don't know exactly, but the Mavericks now at least have a little bit in the toolbox to be able to trade as far as as far as seconds go, and they've been a new sort of currency in the NBA transaction market, really showcased at this past trade deadline. That's important, at least, to have a few seconds in your toolbox to be able to get some of these guys to absorb in your cap space, or just to take back salary for reasons of that nature. It seems like it's going to become a fairly integral part of transaction in this new CBA. So happy that they were able to get that in the deal when it didn't even seem like they were going to get draft compensation initially. So big win by Nico Harrison in the front office, like we mentioned with this deal. Now, before we get into some of the moves that the Mavericks could make at the end of this podcast and talk about the flexibility that they still have in terms of potentially adding, another wing or another center. Me personally, I think the Mavericks are one starter and one rotation player away from title contention. And I don't necessarily think that it has to be, a center starting or a wing off the bench. I think it could honestly be either or. If they were to get another starting caliber wing, and then a rotation big, if they're able to ship out JaVale McGee, that can at least come in and serve as another guy in that bullpen of centers that can provide something a little bit different, something that they maybe don't have. Or if they're able to get a starting center and then another rotation wing to come off the bench. I think either of those two routes, honestly, depending on the players, of course, put the Mavericks in a position where they're thrusted into contention, or at least top 4 of the West. So it'll be very intriguing to see what they do in that front. But they almost had their backup wing here, Matisse Thybulle. The Mavericks threw a very lucrative offer sheet at Matisse Thybulle yesterday. And I believe it was signed earlier today or last night, whenever the deadline was, to where restricted free agents could indeed sign an offer sheet, and then the incumbent team, of course, have 2 days or whatever it is to match under this current rendition of the CBA. The Mavericks could have signed any restricted free agent to an offer sheet as soon as free agency opened. But it's kind of counterintuitive, given that the other team can't start, officially waiting, I guess, to decide if they're going to match the offer sheet, even though they probably have what they're going to do already ironed out in their on the board in the in the off-season room or whatever. Portland is delegating over there. It's probably like the Damian Lillard breakdown room at the moment. But obviously the Mavericks throw this offer sheet at Matisse yesterday, the first day in which Portland has about 48 hours to match. I believe it officially went through sometime last night, for a total of almost the full MLE, 3 years, 11 million with a player option. In the last years, we ended up finding out today, a 15% trade kicker and 50% of his salary needing to be paid out before, or of his annual salary for this year, I should preface, needing to be paid out before October 1st of this year. So obviously, really trying to overpay, really trying to snag Matisse Thybulle away from the Blazers. Jaren, what was your reaction to that move at face value, especially given that it was before the Grant Williams move? And in hindsight, after the Trailblazers have now matched it, are you relieved? Do you think the Mavericks have other guys that they should be looking at in the first place? Or now that, Grant Williams did indeed end up coming to Dallas and we had that sort of blanket of security, is this kind of just sort of a sucky situation that they weren't able to, bolster this even further by getting Matisse Thybulle with the MLE?
Yeah, so in my little big board, I always had like plan B guys and plan C guys, and he was one of the guys that more so fit in that sort of plan B, plan C section. So to see the Mavericks make an offer, especially before the Grant Williams stuff kind of all went down and unfolded, I wasn't necessarily surprised. But in terms of a team building perspective, I didn't want the Mavericks to necessarily go, I guess, just like full in on one guy. That's what I thought this team would do whenever they made that offer. Because again, Portland had 2 or 3 days to match that offer once it was official. So I figured the Mavericks would kind of sit on their hands and wait for that move to be done or to be matched by Portland. And of course, we saw Grant Williams happen, or that whole ordeal happen in between all that. So, from that perspective, I'm glad the Mavericks actually, did things during. But look, I mean, Matisse Thybulle, a very defensive-minded guy. I wasn't, all too excited, but I wasn't, necessarily like, oh, this is going to be just yet another move that we're going to be looking at in a few years and thinking we should have gone different. So, I wasn't necessarily, like I said, excited for the move, but I wasn't opposed because, again, I mean, he is a defensive wing, a defensive-minded guy that you can bring off the bench and is going to have a big production in what he's able to do. So, from that perspective, I was liking it. But again, I wasn't holding my breath that this was going to happen, holding my breath on this move, because again, it was likely that Portland was going to resign. So in hindsight, now that everything's kind of done, Portland, of course, matched that 3-year, 33 million, I believe it was, at that full value. I'm not like, how do I say it? I'm not, totally, discouraged. I'm not, sad. I'm not depressed that this happened. I mean, Matisse Thybulle, again, is a guy that's going to come off the bench and kind of make his due diligence that way. So from that perspective, he wasn't even going to have the hugest role for the Mavericks. So I can't really waste brain power on that. But look, I mean, there's still guys available. Had this been the last free agent, I probably would have taken a lot more, I guess, time to sort of digest all that. But yeah, I mean, look, Matisse Thybulle was like one of 4 guys left at the time. Of course, Grant Williams is off the board now. He's in Dallas. So look, I mean, there's still different moves that this team could make in that restricted free agent market, but I wasn't holding my breath or anything like that. I don't know if you felt differently, Will, but look, I mean, for a defensive specialist, it would have been good on a defensive side, but offensively would have been a huge question mark. And I'm glad that we at least have our answer now, and we're not waiting. So because that would be a whole dramatic ordeal. But look, I mean, for the less than 24-hour period that it was looking like he was possibly going to be a Maverick, it would have been fun. So that's all I got to say. But I'm not glad, I'm not mad that he's not in a Mavericks uniform. Portland had to do from a roster building perspective, they pretty much had to retain him, and so at least for them, I'm glad that they did.
I mean, I would push back given their sort of roster building situation right now. Portland's in a sort of precarious position. Once they do move on from Damian Lillard, they still have Jeremy Grant at this, full huge 5-year max. And then they have, Simon still, and then Scoot's coming into fruition. So who knows exactly how good they're going to be next year. This could be a team that's yet again in the bottom portion of the Western Conference, not even close to sniffing the play-in, or they could actually be somewhat competitive if Scoot really comes in there and is able to catalyze, the start of an era for them, right? But needless to say, with these moves, I don't think that the Blazers were necessarily in a position where their hand was forced to, sign Thybulle, especially given their potential lack of competitiveness next year. But there's no reason to completely neglect a really young wing who's 6'5" and has made two all defensive teams in his career in Philadelphia. I know he's a little bit of an unorthodox defender, in the standpoint that he's a very savvy off-ball defender, is very good at picking passing lanes. Is a pretty good one-on-one defender, but it's definitely not his niche. He's definitely a guy that, is more of a recovery defender, is really good at sort of, forecasting what, an opposing offensive player is going to do once he gets beat, and is able to, make the correct switch, or be able to recover for a chase down block or get a steal from behind. I thought he could have been a great point of attack and off ball defender for the Mavericks off the bench, especially if they were able to sort of get him to hone in a little bit, be a little less gamble prone with some of those scenarios in terms of his one-on-one defense. I thought the Mavericks could have really built an Australian trifecta of swarming kangaroos with Dante Exum, Josh Green, and of course Matisse Thybulle there off the bench. At least Josh Green and Matisse, two uber athletic sort of 6'5" dudes who can get after it on defense. But of course Matisse, he is definitely not shown even a semblance of a really competent offensive game throughout his NBA career so far. At least for NBA standards. He's a really good transition guy. He gets out there fast. He's, he gets to running, and he's not afraid to, finish with some contact out in the open. But, barring that, he is in the low 30s, high 20s for his career 3-point shooting percentage. And he did have a pretty good stint with Portland there, those last 20 games or so, where he started shooting the ball at a much better mark. Particularly in the catch and shoot area, but he was being spoon fed some of those looks. A lot of the, sort of data on those looks were, he was looking at wide open shots. Defenders were purposely leaving him open in the corner, things of that nature. And he was able to capitalize at almost a 40% clip for those last 20 or so games with the Trailblazers on catch and shoot corner threes or whatever category it was. But, there's still a lot of question marks with his shot. He is 26, and I'm not saying that there's not still time for him to hit his developmental trajectory or, stay, going up on the developmental curve with that shot. But I do think, especially as his NBA career goes by, that lack of a shot definitely can come back to bite him in the playoffs, even at certain junctures in the regular season. And, he definitely is not the most non-one-dimensional guy, if that makes any sense. But he did have some potential definitely as a cutter, especially if he could improve that outside shot to be a pretty serviceable offensive player. And I wouldn't, take it away from him at this stage in his career. Al-Farouq Aminu, he developed a 3-point shot, I want to say in his mid-20s kind of. So it wouldn't have been pedestrian for, the Mavericks to have brought this guy along. And I would have been hyping it up here. I would have been, leading the brigade for Matisse Thybulle in Dallas. I would have been really hyped at the move, even though it would have been a drastic overpay. It's the sort of thing that you kind of have to do in restricted free agency. And if the Mavericks could have got a center and, still make the Grant Williams move as they were poised to do, they're still sitting at that first apron right there. They're not heavy into the luxury tax or anything like that. You do overpay a little bit, but it's not something that necessarily hurts you. And, you're only adding on to an abundance of help that you were able to accrue over the offseason. So I definitely would have liked the move. For me personally, I thought there's still a little potential in his offensive game. And the defense, as good as it is, even with some of those deficiencies, I just think that there are things that can be worked around, especially in Jason Kidd's system, which, if I do have to give him credit for in terms of one thing that has been a sticking point in his time in Dallas, especially at least in 2021-22. He has been very defensive oriented. I think Matisse could have, would have fit seamlessly with the culture and everything. He's always seemed like, a true professional. So I would have really welcomed him in Dallas, and it sucks that the Trailblazers, went ahead and decided to match it. But, like I said, they are in a position to where things, don't necessarily matter in terms of, cost cutting and, other moves like that. They're not in a position where they're trying to contend. So, you might as well keep him from their perspective. You just trade for him and see what he materializes into. I can't blame them. But the Mavericks did throw them a real albatross of a contract there that that's gonna be sort of hanging around their neck till Matisse Thybulle's time in Portland expires. If he doesn't, develop a competent outside shot, I'd say his sort of dollar amount, what he's actually worth, is probably well under that 11 million per year. But I would have been okay with the overpay given the situation the Mavericks were in, adding another point of attack defender that can, defend 1 through 3, maybe even guard up on occasion. It would have been a great move, at least in my opinion. Not an elite move by any standards, because that contract definitely could come back to bite the Mavericks here on in the future had that materialized. But of course, Portland matches the offer sheet earlier today. Like I would probably carry the same sentiment as Jaren. I wasn't necessarily like shocked or depressed that they matched the offer sheet, but also, I wasn't, completely, gleeful and, jumping all over the room. Like I feel like some people on Mavs Twitter were, who thought the Matisse Thybulle contract was so bad that they simply just, could not bear it and were waiting for, Portland to go ahead and match the offer sheet to the people in that crowd. I'm happy that things were able to work out in your favor. But otherwise, not, a totally sort of depressing topic of discussion here for the Mavericks in terms of losing Matisse Thybulle. I believe it's the third restricted free agent in the last 20 years that they were not able to pry away from another team that actually ended up, getting his offer sheet matched by his incumbent team. But it was a good effort by Nico Harrison in the front office, given the sort of limited players at that mid-level exception range at this stage in free agency, because a lot of the guys that we thought were poised to land there, potentially even a Naz Reid who got, extended before the season even started, as well as Dylan Brooks, guys of that nature, didn't even hit the market or, signed well above and beyond and before what the Mavericks could offer. So I'm not totally been out over shape over it, but I do wish that, it did materialize in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I honestly, I agree with everything that you said. I think you said that very well. But look, I mean, from a contract perspective, it would have been, definitely way more of an overpay. But look, for the time and for the sort of situation at hand, you'd kind of have to overpay for a guy of that caliber. So, I wouldn't have been opposed to it, had he signed for that dollar figure in Dallas. And look, I mean, even though it didn't, sort of come into fruition, it was definitely fun 24 hours to have him sort of not in our grasp, but have him in the news and everything like that. And it was very fun to see. And just like I said, a drama filled 24 hours it gives us content. And unfortunately Portland matched it, but look, that definitely would have filled the wing position of need. Definitely would have rounded that out. And at that point, I think that there's only one more move. Assuming Matisse was coming to Dallas, there would be only one real move left, and that's to sign a starting, or maybe not sign, to trade for a center, whether it's rotational or a starting caliber guy. But look, that didn't happen. This team is still, of course, 2 moves away, in my opinion. Like you had said, a starting caliber center and a rotational wing, or a starting caliber wing and a rotational center. I'm cool with whatever, in my opinion. But this team is still 2 guys away from potentially competing for an NBA championship. And look, there's different routes, there's different guys. But look, I'm excited for these next few hours or next few days rather, because I think one of those moves will probably be done in the next few days.
Yeah, no, I particularly with the starting center move, I could see that being a situation that ends up, feeding late into the offseason, especially, seeing how other teams' rosters are going to round out after, Damian Lillard and James Harden get moved, the two biggest dominoes on the NBA trade market right now. That might create some log jams at certain spots for teams, given their involvement in certain trades and things like that, to where, a starting center that you originally thought may not be available could become available. There's obviously a few guys that we'll mention here that the Mavericks could, potentially go after with, not only their first round pick, but with those newly acquired second round picks as well. I do think now that the Mavericks have those second round picks, that it would be wise to not have to expel a first round pick unless it's a, damn near all-star starting level center, right? Or you're getting a starting level center along with potentially a wing. Another area of consideration that the Mavericks can take into from a flexibility perspective is taking back a little bit more of salary in a trade. They can, take back that 125%, sort of salary in a trade, comparable to maybe only if they're only sending out like 100%. You'd have to go through the trade machine on Spotrac or whatever to see exactly what I'm talking about. But of course, with the Mavericks operating under that first apron, still having about 8 or 9 million left, they could choose to not use their mid-level exception and just trade for a wing and a center, take back a little excess salary if they can make the deal work. That is definitely a route that, could be plausible. They could still split the MLE into two, potentially sign 2 year or two guys on like a 6-point-something million contract for however many years, like potentially a Kelly Oubre or a Derek Jones Jr. There's restricted free agent Paul Reed out there who, would definitely feed into the competent big man category. I think if the Mavericks were to throw an offer sheet like at that, like him, he's definitely going to fit into more of the mold of the off the bench center. And the Mavericks would then maybe need to redirect into focusing on getting a sort of highly coveted wing or a guy that can at least step up a little bit more in that department. Because I don't know if Paul Reed is a starting caliber big, but he is a sort of Maxey-esque type of guy that backed up Embiid last year, real switchable sort of 4, maybe even 5, that can also play, drop coverage and defend the paint when need be, is a sort of pseudo rim protector. But that's not his primary defensive sort of focus. I mean, he is a guy, like I said, that's pretty switchable at his size, can guard 4s and, step out on the perimeter on 5s fairly well. So, I mean, that's a guy I would be looking at. He also has a decent shot. He played pretty well during that playoff run for Philadelphia. If the Mavericks are to go the route of adding another bullpen center and then trying to look for a wing on the trade market, keep an eye on Paul Reed, even though he's not necessarily that starting caliber center the Mavericks, would want to get. I know Philadelphia does want to retain him, so the Mavericks would probably have to overpay with that MLE in the same sort of fashion that they did with Matisse Thybulle, but definitely wouldn't say that would be out of the ordinary or a move that you shouldn't see coming. Some other guys than the Mavericks could potentially target in trades as far as centers go. Like I said earlier in the podcast, the Mavericks still have the trade pieces of Tim Hardaway Jr., Maxi Kleber, JaVale McGee, even Rashawn Holmes. Potentially not Rashawn Holmes with other players, but they're at least going to be able to ship him off by himself. So they still have a lot of flexibility. The Mavericks still have a ton of shooting guards, especially if they got Matisse Thybulle. It almost seemed like you could maybe even pencil in Tim Hardaway Jr. to be on his way out, but maybe there's a little bit more gray area now in terms of him getting shipped off. But look, there's obviously still other moves for this Mavericks team to make in regards to adding a wing or, a starting caliber big man. And with the flexibility that they have, they are poised to do so. It's just a matter if they can find the right deals, at a fair price. And if they can, get another team to, be as peaked in their interest in terms of some of the Mavericks assets as they could possibly be. So it will definitely have to see, this sort of weird fluctuating situation after Thybulle, of course, ends up getting retained by the Blazers and they match his offer sheet. We're going to have to see how it all pans out. But personally, Jaren, how do you see some of these moves ending up for the Mavericks, and what directions do you think they could potentially go in, given the flexibility that they have with the mid-level exception still, as well as on the trade market with assets like JaVale McGee, Tim Hardaway Jr., even if they're not good assets, they are assets, still applicable to be traded here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Mavericks, in terms of route going, I think that the Mavericks are probably more keen on, acquiring a starting caliber center. That's kind of been in the rumor mill probably, for 6 days now. I mean, even longer than that, like
Yeah.
years. But the Mavericks definitely are in the market of acquiring a starting caliber guy now, with the assets that they have, or at least the assets that they're willing to deal. So look, there's multiple names, definitely like Jared Allen, Ivica Zubac. Those are the guys that kind of mentioned or jump out to me. But there's some other guys on the market that would probably be available at a smaller price. But in terms of starting caliber, those are the top two names to me. But I
Maybe
think, definitely in terms of route going, the Mavericks would be more keen on getting a starting caliber center. And look, I mean, this team could possibly go into the season with a position of need still needed. I'm not necessarily opposed to that as long as they are rounding out the issues of, most importance. But if this team, went into the offseason either without a wing, I like, the thing is they have the assets to, get these two positions of need this year, this offseason. So I don't think there's really an excuse to go into the season without those two positions of need kind of unaccounted for. But look, if they are going to end of the season, or if that is a plan of theirs, I would rather it be the wing position, because I just don't think that there is a center on this team who can start. I mean, you could have made that argument last year, but look, I just think this team is probably way more keen, especially from what we've heard, on getting a center rather than a wing. But I definitely still think that they know that they need another wing on this roster to round out this team.
Yeah. And I mean, we know that they'll at least have one more move on the tank, even if it's just a mere salary dump, because JaVale McGee, as reported by Marc Stein, in some sort of form or fashion or another, is going to end up at least either being a stretch wave for the Mavericks in the worst case scenario, or dumped. So they, do have the room to be able to facilitate another MLE signing. So if they do wish to use that MLE potentially between two guys, then we'll see what happens. Another guy that I could see the Mavericks throwing an offer sheet at, maybe an Io DeSumo from the Bulls. He'd be a little harder to pry away given how young he is. I believe he's like a second round pick or whatever. So, or maybe he was a first round pick, but the way his contract worked out, he ended up hitting restricted free agency fairly early on. Maybe they could get him. At that point, you definitely got to move on from one of your guards, though, because even, compared to Matisse, he's definitely more of a point guard on offense. And the Mavericks would definitely have a pretty definitive logjam there. So that would be an interesting situation to monitor. But there are still some guys the Mavericks could offer part of the MLE to, potentially splitting it between Seth Curry, or they could just sign Seth Curry to the biannual exception, shed some of that McGee salary, and of course, still be poised to split it between two guys or give the full MLE to one guy. I think at this point, if they are going to use the MLE, it's probably going to be between two guys. I don't know if there's any other guys on the market that are poised to, be able to get the whole MLE by themselves. But we will go ahead and see exactly what they do with that flexibility that they have there. And then, Tim Hardaway Jr. is, I think, the biggest question mark going forward. What are the Mavericks going to do with his salary? Richaun Holmes potentially as well, but that move has not been made official yet. So we'll see if they end up doing anything else with that flexibility there, in terms of being able to acquire a starting caliber big man. If they do go into the offseason, like Jaren said, with or the season rather, they go into media day one without either of those positions, I would hope that it's that backup wing position. I think that is a little less integral to the success of the team than a starting caliber center. but it'll be an interesting situation to monitor. PJ Washington is another name that definitely to at least look for. The Mavericks would have to sign and trade for him. I don't even know exactly how the sort of ramifications of that deal, what they would entail. Because I know it would be complex. I know he's seeking a pretty big dollar amount, hence why I think Charlotte probably hasn't been able to get him yet, especially after striking out on Grant Williams. You'd think that they are very much poised to re-sign him, but he was in the rumor mill, not really from anybody credible, but from just a lot of people on NBA Twitter. So if the Mavericks were to go more of the wing route, I mean, what a get that would be at this stage in the offseason. And then, adding, maybe a starting or a fringe starting center or another guy that can be in rotation, you have a complete offseason at that point. So they have a lot of different routes they can still go. It's just a matter of which one of those routes are attainable, which are plausible, and which they could actually execute upon, before the season's, begins. Because I think if we've learned one thing with Nico Harrison, he makes these really, really good moves, but he's not a guy. He doesn't seem like a GM that will just, take these, bigger sort of risks, is going to go for some of these deals that may or may not even, be on the table in the first place. So we'll monitor it going forward for sure. But I don't, know if the Mavericks are done, or if they are not. But I can tell you as much as that I think the Mavericks don't want to be done. I think that they still recognize the holes within this roster, still want to improve, but they did a great job in that by getting Grant Williams today. And I mean, if this is only the beginning of a couple more moves to be made for this offseason, what a systematic turnaround that the Mavericks were able to make after, a huge down year after the Western Conference Finals. Props to the front office and everybody if they are, but furthermore, even right now, great moves that they've made so far. I would at least give them a B at the complete low end if the offseason ended today. I know you said B plus. It would kind of just depend on how things end up panning out, but at the very least, given their moves, the Mavericks have hit the nail on the head in the offseason so far, and I think there's still a lot more in the tank. And I don't want to be a Donnie Nelson to the fan base by saying that, and then nothing ended up coming to fruition. Don't blame me at the end of the day. I'm not, making the decisions up on a Nowitzki way or, in the depths of the AAC office. But if I had to guess, I still think there's more moves on the horizon. Jaren, do you have any lasting predictions for what's to happen going forward?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have any predictions or any.
There's a lot of different directions they could go into.
There is, and that's why I think
nice about this.
That's why, yeah, absolutely, and that's why I think predicting things is very, very hard to do, especially with today's NBA and especially covering the Mavericks, because right now it seems like they're in every rumor possible. And look, I mean, they got Grant Williams, an absolute amazing get. And I mean, of course, that backup wing and a starting center, in my opinion, are probably the biggest positions of need. So we'll see what this team can do. But in my opinion, I would agree with you. I don't think that this team is done by any means. I still think that they're probably going to get for sure one of the last two positions of needs. So it just kind of depends on which one they get or which one they do try and go for. So look, absolute positive offseason thus far. And, we're only 6 days into quote for quote the offseason, and we're about to get into summer league. So we're about to get in some exciting things, with free agency and with the trade market still going on. So I'm excited to see what happens. But again, if I had any predictions to make, within the next few days, the Mavericks are going to make a move, and they're going to make hopefully a good move, that is, with a starting center. That would be the absolute best. If we could get a Zubats, or if we could get a Jared Allen, my God, I mean, I might go full fan sort of speculation, and I will start tattooing 2024 championship on my back already. Yes. So, but in all seriousness, if they could acquire a guy of that caliber, Dallas might be set on fire. So it would be a crazy time to be alive. And
I know Marc Stein did say in his Substack chat that he doesn't know if the Mavericks would have the wherewithal to go after a guy like a Jared Allen, or if Zubac would even be available. I mean, there's a lot of guys to monitor. Look at a Daniel Gafford up in Washington. That's a pretty disgruntled situation. I mean, that's a guy still with a lot of potential at his age. Look at him. And of course, those other two guys, we don't know how those situations are going to play out in Los Angeles. as well as Cleveland if they make any more moves, via trade to where, they do create a situation to where they're comfortable moving on with one of those guys. And that'd be very interesting, especially Allen. I mean, the Mavericks probably have to empty the asset pool, but I mean, it would be probably well worth it given the trade that could potentially come out on that front. So it's an exciting time to be a Mavericks fan. I will say, in terms of my prediction, that I think we'll have answers within the next 48 hours in regards to some sort of direction that the Mavericks are going to pick, whether we get some report that there's really not much heating up on the trade market for a center until after the James Harden and Damian Lillard sagas unfold. I could see us, Marc Stein potentially dropping something where the Mavericks are going to kind of stand pat for a little bit, see how everything goes. Or the ability at least to exercise some of that MLE money, if they choose to do that, or if they'd rather take back a wing in the trade in a trade at this point. I think we'll at least have answers within the next 48 hours. I hope, at least, and it'll be really exciting to see whatever future moves they do, if they actually do something. But great offseason up until this point. Even if it were to end today, it's definitely not a terrible offseason. I think that's what most excites me, but they have a lot of opportunities to be able to maybe get two guys, even with that MLE, as potentially, as well as potentially a starting caliber center. Now, it may not be the most lucrative guys that we end up signing with our remaining money, but I mean, we could at least take a pinch on some flyers and see where it goes. So, or take back a little bit of excess salary in a trade. So like I said, just a lot of different directions, a lot of more flexibility, and the Mavericks get their starting 3/4 in Dallas. This is an exciting time to be a Mavericks fan, especially if they continue to burn the boats here. If they continue to burn the boats, throw them in the air, claim their territory upon, the NBA stampede, and establish themselves as champions, like Chuck Cooperstein famously said on the radio call once the Mavericks beat the Heat in Game 6. I don't know if I hit the nail on the quote exactly, but it was something like that, something of that ilk. So we're just going to go ahead and roll with it.
It was something of that nature, yeah.
Yes, it was. But they could be right back in that neighborhood given the right moves. And I think that's the perfect point to end the podcast on. Over celebrating a little bit over a year of this podcast. Last year, Jaren, we were in complete despair, having just lost Jalen Brunson, hanging on to Christian Wood, somehow becoming an all-star as our only sort of string of hope, as well as Jaden Hardy's development in summer league. We're poised with a lot more readiness, playoff readiness. I think a lot more talent now, a lot more excitement, and you might just screw around and catch me and Jaren at one of these summer league games if the Mavericks continue to turn on this brigade, because it's got to a point of excitement that our financial statuses may not have to be taken into account anymore. Sometimes,
it might just be a fucking mentality.
Money is merely an ancillary object, meant to, facilitate the transactions of goods and services here in the world. But to the mainstream Mavs podcasts, we don't hold much weight to those things over true experiences. We really
Absolutely.
are, your idealized sort of young experience havers over here, and we're going to provide the most in-depth coverage because of that. So if there's one thing that you can look forward to with us, is that we're going to go broke in 4 years. But other than that, we are going to end the podcast on that note. Thank you for listening to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. It's been a really exciting one. I can't wait to see what the Mavericks are going to do going forward. Even if there's no moves made, Jaren, I think we should cop back on in the next day or two. We took a little bit of a leave of absence there, kind of at least seeing what would happen at the start of free agency. Not necessarily leave of absence. We definitely covered the Seth Curry news and all that sort of stuff, but I think it's time to get churning on some of these Seth Curry, Grant Williams fits, potentially, if the Mavericks end up prolonging this offseason period, in terms of still being able to acquire more talent. So we'll definitely be a little bit more consistent in between days, be providing some more content for you guys. We really appreciate all the feedback. Make sure to keep getting at us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We are available on almost any podcast listening platform. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating. follow us, turn on your post notifications, give us a 5-star review if you so please. We would really appreciate any feedback, whether it be constructive or just terrible in all capacity. We probably deserve it, so just give it to us, and we will get back to you with a loving message. And also make sure to get at us on YouTube, of course, like I had mentioned, Mainstream Mavs Podcast on YouTube. The videos be going crazy, even though Jaren's camera quality was probably suffering for about 75% of this because he's currently in a cabin hiding from a tornado in Indiana. So that's just merely happenstance. We can't do much about some of these things. We're going to record
Can't do much about that,
regardless of the climate, regardless of any other sort of outside factors. Even if we do go to Las Vegas and I end up losing my life savings on the slot machines, there will still be a podcast that night. Rest assured. So make sure to comment down below. What do you think the Mavericks move is going to be next? And if you're a real loyal listener and you really care, comment down below. Where should Jaren's setup be next? Where's the next destination in the United States he needs to go to record from? Because we might be sending him around the globe now. He might be the Mainstream Mavs global ambassador. We got big things coming over here. So you guys just let us know that. And other than that, make sure to get out our Twitter, of course, our new Twitter at Mainstream214. If you have not followed us on our new Twitter, make sure to please go do that. We are trying to build that platform up, and it's huge for our podcast. So we would really appreciate that. But other than that, Grant Williams is a Maverick. And I think I just saw the Batman signal outside, Jaren. I think we did
see just. Yeah, we got to go. Batman's outside. Batman's outside.